Emilie Schario. So Emilie is a head of data at Netlify. She was previously the first data analyst at GitLab, where she watched the org grow from under 300 to over 1,300 team members. So please welcome Emilie Schario. The title of her presentation is Breaking Your Data Team Out of the Service Trap. So Emilie, the stage is yours.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for having me. My name is Emilie Schario. I'm going to be speaking today on breaking your data team out of the service trap. What I'm really hoping to do with this talk is less about giving prescriptive instructions and more about starting a conversation around how we build and grow effective data teams. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. A little bit about me. I'm currently a data strategist in residence at Amplify Partners, a venture firm focused on early stage companies in the data, dev, and cloud infrastructure spaces. I was until 2 weeks ago, I was director of data and business intelligence at Netlify. I was previously the first the first data person at or data analyst at GitLab, and kind of have a background of being early data person at a number of companies. A little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to tell you about the Netlify data team, and a lot of the talks and groups that I referenced or experiences that I referenced during this talk will come from my time leading the Netlify data team. We'll talk about the mission of a data team, where data teams are, where they want to be, and how we get there. So this was the data stack at Netlify. We used a number of tools to move data from external outside of our warehouse into our Snowflake data warehouse. We use dbt as our transformation tool. We use dbt core for transforming our models, and dbt cloud to orchestrate our jobs. We use transform as a metric store, census for operational analytics, and mode for BI. Of course, this is not the only data stack, and we'll talk a little bit more about what each of these tools did for us in later on in the presentation. So perhaps you may have seen this meme on the internet. It is my only claim to fame, perhaps. But I really was struck by how often people felt that building a data team was just like pulling a number really quickly, and struggled to understand why that wasn't something that was more easily done or more quickly done, and put this together kind of in jest, shared it with a couple of friends on Twitter, and it happened to take off. And the big feedback that I heard over and over was people failed to really comprehend how much telling people no was going to be a part of their job when they joined data, and how much getting alignment on what things like explaining what a customer means was going to be a part, and standardizing on the definition of customer or revenue or whatever the metric is was going to be. The other one that I'll highlight here is convincing people to track things before they want data for it. It's a good old difficult problem. So what is the purpose of a data team? You have an answer in your head, hopefully, what your data team's doing for your organization. Hopefully it's to help the organization make better decisions. Is that what your data team does? This is our data team mission at Netlify. So the data team exists to empower the entire organization to make the best decisions possible by providing accurate, timely, and useful insights. Think about that. To empower the entire organization to make the best decisions possible by providing accurate, timely, and useful insights. So by providing insights. But today, that's not the case that most data teams are in, right? Data teams are bombarded with asks. For example, people want to know where their new users are coming from, what adoption of a new feature looks like, which marketing source is generating the lowest CAC. Like, it is these are all great questions, but the data teams are overwhelmed by their inability to answer and tackle all of them. But even though data teams are overwhelmed by this, people don't trust the work of the data team. So 1 in 3 executives uses data that they don't trust to make big decisions. 50% of a knowledge worker's time is spent hunting, finding, verifying, looking for confirmatory sources for data they don't trust. And 85% of all big data investments are considered failure. Right? Put together, these 3 stats say people don't trust the work of the data team, and most data teams are failing. How do we turn that around? Well, we have to figure out what's causing it. And I think it's this. Data teams are stuck in this vicious cycle that I like to call the cycle of sadness, where a team rushes to put out analysis because there's so much to do. And because stakeholders kind of have what they're looking for the results to be in mind, if the analysis doesn't match their expectations, the stakeholders question it. And the team ends up spending a lot of time proving the numbers to that stakeholder. And then the team can't get to new work because they're spending all their time proving things, and there's a backlog of existing technical debt. So when they get to the analysis, they just rush to put out something. It's a pretty tough situation to be in. And it's really because the data teams are stuck being seen as service organizations. Question comes in, answer goes out. Kind of like IT organizations. This is problematic because it puts teams squarely in a reactive camp instead of a proactive camp. And what this means is that data team isn't creating insights, they're answering questions for other people. But is that what they should be doing? Right? Remember, we talked about that data team mission. What is the goal of the data team? It's to provide insights. So if we're spending all of our time answering questions, can we or are we providing insights? The service model is all wrong, because if we spend all of our time answering questions for other, we never deliver insights to the rest of the business. You can think of this kind of like an engineer who is stuck in meetings and never has time to code. If we define success for the data team based on the insights we deliver, like we did in that mission statement, then we need to be focused on delivering insights, not just answering questions for other people. This doesn't mean we throw the service model out the window, right? Instead of building our data teams as service organizations, we need to reframe our work as building a data product that enables the business to make better decisions. So maybe you've heard me talk about this before. I wrote a blog post for Locally Optimistic, which is a data community, around running your data team like a product team with my colleague Taylor Murphy, who I worked with at GitLab and is now head of product at Meltano. And I would strongly encourage you to go take a peek. We're going to dig into that a lot more, or we're not going to dig into that a lot more. The blog post covers details on what this means and what this mindset is. But oftentimes people are like, yeah, great, that sounds awesome. So how do I do it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we actually break your team out of the service trap? So when we think about that, we have to first start with what type of work, what does your team, your data organization do for the business? And I've bucketed it into these 5 categories: operational analytics, metrics management, data insights, experimentation reporting, and servicing other people. So there are other things your team will do, but we're focused on the kind of work that drives impact to the business. And that's what we're going to cover today. So things like, managing permissions for your data infrastructure and modeling data so it's ready for use. Yes, those are the responsibilities of your data team. That is work that your team has to do, but it is not the work that drives the impact to the business. It is the foundational work that must occur. So let's go through each of these kinds of work one at a time. First, operational analytics. You need data from System X and System Y. At Netlify, we use Census for this. And the business impact is increased access to data across the company. So for example, now you could segment users based on their usage data and pump that into your CRM or emailing tool. Next is metrics management. So a tool like Transform, which is what we use at Netlify, the goal being reduce repeated asks for metrics that already exist. How often are team members fielding questions like, yeah, but what was our revenue last month? When really what we need to do is just make it easier for people to find that information on their own. Next, data insights. So the problem is that people don't even know what questions to ask. And this is something that your data team can do. As your data team is doing analyses for whatever bucket of work they're working on, what they need to do is also look a little bit further, shift the analysis to the side, expand the scope just a little, and see what they can find. And the way we handle this, and I'll show you just a second, at Netlify was through something called an insights feed. There's a great blog post also on Locally Optimistic by my Netlify colleague, Paige Berry, on sharing your insights with your organization. I think this is one of the most impactful categories of work that your data team can be doing. And it is the #1 category of work that gets pushed to the side when time gets tight, unfortunately. So what does building and collecting data insights actually mean? To me, it's about creating an insights hub where anyone in your organization can help understand the things that the data team is finding. First, you build institutional memory with the work you're doing. Second, you help onboard people to the work of the data team, independent of their role in the organization. And 3, you make it really easy for people to take away the things that the data team is finding. So here is what the insights feed at Netlify looked like. It can, I had to cover a little bit going on here, but the general gist is that this is an internal blog where the headline was just the takeaway. People who use pens with this thing on them are 10 times more likely to convert. Or signups on Saturday is less likely to convert, probably associated with hobby projects. Whatever the takeaway is, you just kind of have that there so that people can skim and still get the information. And then people could click in to get additional detail on what the analysis was, what the method was, what the charts look like, and how someone came to the takeaway that they came to. And then we would combine these insights that we were finding in the data with our metrics management, so our usage of Transform, to consolidate everything into what we call an insights hub, where we had a metric definition, we had real filterable numbers that someone could easily slice and dice. We could have people ask questions, and we could include annotations and insights right where people were looking on the metric. So for example, the metric, the screenshots that I have here are on a messages sent metric. This is just some dummy data. But you can see kind of this metric sent metric, people could, messages sent metric, people could easily slice and dice. They could have information around outages, around insights that people had found. For example, if messages sent were a good leading indicator for conversion or whatever it might be, just kind of having that all in one place for the organization. The next bucket of work that your team does is experimentation reporting. So first, as an organization grows to be more oriented towards growth and experimenting, it can be very hard to create a way to kind of scale those analyses, or every experiment will require individual time by a person. At Netlify, we were still doing individual analyses for every experiment, but we were exploring a tool called EPO for that. And finally, servicing other people, right? There's some level of people have questions, and the data team is the people who have the keys to the kingdom. So being able to answer that for other people is still something that the data team needs to be doing. At Netlify, inbound asks came in through GitHub, and analyses were either pointing people towards something that already existed or doing an analysis in mode. So given that we have to do service work, how do we do service work in the way that best sets the team up for success? And really, I think what we need to do is flip their questions on their head. So don't let people come in and say, hey, I want a bar chart. It needs to look like this. Like, I want this to be red and that to be blue. And these are the axes. Like, instead, use user stories and understand the problems that people are trying to solve for. So saying, as the head of finance, I want to see revenue on a weekly basis so that I can anticipate where we're going to be at the end of the month, whatever it might be. Remember that your team is not just widget builders building off specs, you're problem solvers. So data teams need to understand the problem that they're building for before they can actually build solutions. So if we recap that, this is what that looks like, where the team is doing these 5 buckets of work. I've included here the tools that we use at Netlify, but also other possible tools. And there are many others. Excuse me. There are many others, but remember, the goal of this work is to drive business impact, not just kind of expand the scope of your team. So how does this actually work in practice? You've gotten the theory, but what does it look like for an organization? Well, there's 2 paths we're going to cover today. The first is if you're building a data team from scratch, and if you're already part of an existing data team that's not operating in this model. So first, if you're building from scratch, I suggest that you go from left to right. Most teams go from right to left. So most organizations, when they're building out data functions, it's all about service. It's all about answering other people's questions. And frankly, in the early stages, that's because it's easier, right? It's much easier to answer questions for other people when you're not being bombarded with them. It's much easier to not think about what you're building. It's much easier to just kind of be the number fetcher for others. But that sets your team up into this service trap permanently. So instead, what we want to do, and my suggestion is that you go left to right, left to right. Start with operational analytics and build the plumbing that the rest of your organization is going to take advantage of. And as you do the next kinds of work, you can then put that data in other systems, making it easy to access. So as you move from operational analytics to KPIs and metrics management, you think about that as, for example, defining revenue per customer. And now you can put your single source of truth of revenue and take that data and put it in your CRM so that your salespeople can see the actual revenue number instead of like kind of what they remember from the last contract. Or you can flag the number of support tickets in your CRM so that your customer success team gets more visibility into the customers than they had before. So lots of opportunities there. Then after you've identified your key KPIs and metrics, you can focus more on data insights. So surfacing the information you're finding in a news feed, it could be a Slack channel, or in the case that I showed earlier, it's kind of like a blog roll, and work loudly. Remember that your work can only be impactful if people know about it. Then run some experimentation, encourage people to do it, help them volunteer to do the analysis, drive and build that culture of looking and using data, teach people about MDE, statistical significance, relevant key terms, the things they need to know to be successful in a data-driven organization. And finally, last but not least, is servicing others. But by focusing on high impact work, people will be more tolerant of waiting, and you will be proactive and answer their questions before they have them. So it'll actually overall reduce the amount of servicing you have to do for others. How do you organize your data team? Remember, we're thinking about building from scratch. What you want to do is ensure that everyone on your data team, data engineers, analytics engineers, and data analysts, report into a data team. Remember that as a data team member, you are entitled to have a manager who understands your job. And that means that we need to put data team members reporting into data organizations. Then you also want to develop some way of building business partnerships with other parts of the organization. What that means isn't that people develop a domain knowledge where they only understand that domain. For example, your data analyst supporting finance is not only limited to working on financial data. She or he must be able to also jump into product analyses, but that finance group sets the prioritization. So she's in that team, understands their problems day in and day out, but she can take a bigger picture view of the data. And your data team requires resources if they're going to be effective. So when you think about headcount, you want to be 3 to 10% of the company. When you think about people, funding the people in that headcount need to come from the people who are going to be consuming those resources. And think about the tooling that you need. Make sure your tooling is working for you, not against you. So find partners who benefit from the data org's value to help fund. Now, the much more common reality is that you are in an already existing data team. So what do you do and how do you start implementing some of these things when you can't start from scratch? Well, depending on your level in the organization, it can feel like making change is out of your power. For example, you may feel like a lowly data analyst, like you're not. I want to put that idea out of your head. Because you can make an impact. And we're going to talk about very specific tactical ways you can do that independent of your title in the organization. So first, you can use Slack to start changing your data culture, or Teams, or whatever your chat tool is. The first is encouraging data literacy. So creating a data reads channel where you can share cool articles or newsletters to help build a data literate culture would be great. One example would be sharing the 2 blog posts or the 3 blog posts that I've mentioned today, right? Like the locally optimistic post that I co-authored with Taylor Murphy, the locally optimistic post by my former Netlify colleague, Paige Berry, and Eric Bernhardson's blog post on how to organize a data team. Like those would be 3 really great places to share. And as you stumble on more, you can always add and kind of let that be a place where people who are caring about data are starting to get information. Next, you want to make sure that the things your data team is finding is surfacing its way to the company. I generally prefer to share data insights first in that internal blog structure that I mentioned so that you can cross-post and kind of link people to that. It's easier and it kind of lasts longer if it's not getting lost to Slack. But also share them where people are working. In this case, I strongly suggest Slack. Data Insights channel is great. At Netlify, it was called Stats and Graphs. So whatever your naming convention is, go with that. And there's more that you can do, again, independent of your title or level in an organization. First, you want to find partners in other parts of the business who can help leverage the work that the data team is doing. So find a team to collaborate with, like UX research, which is doing qualitative research, or product or design, whatever that looks like in your organization. Find an executive sponsor to engage in a habit loop. Be proactive, surface information for them, let it drive something, bring it back to them, and let them become someone who feels and understands and advocates for the work of the data team. Add an intro to data at this company as part of your company's onboarding. So introduce people from the moment they start, how to interact with the data team and what data adoption looks like. Host regular office hours where people can bring questions. I've had mixed results with office hours, but there's a great talk by Jacob Fraxon, who's currently at Montreal Analytics, on data clinics, which are the same thing that I'd encourage you to take a peek at. Like I said, the goal there is to make the company feel like the data team is available to answer questions. And finally, focus on fewer markets, so fewer teams served well, rather than trying to serve the whole company from the beginning. And then finally, you want to prioritize proactive insights for your organization. So start small, carve out just 2 to 3 hours of deep work every week. You probably waste that much time on Twitter anyway, but only work on something you can actually find and deliver in that window. And this is not indicative of conversion, is finding something. So even if the results are, there's no results, that is a result. So it's okay to dig in and just start finding things and answering questions that other people did not bring to you. Share what you're finding loudly. Like I said, if you find anything and nobody knows about it or doesn't get spoken about or shared, you might as well have not found it, right? Like it doesn't matter if people aren't using your work. Insights add up. So Tom on my team, when we were talking about this, he said, before I knew it, we had a whole page of insights. So doing it once and then twice and then 3 times and then 4 times and every person on your team doing it, you will change the culture of how people see the work of the data team if you can just start by carving out 2 to 3 hours of deep work every week. And remember, these are just your appetizers. They're small. It's just about finding something that kind of shapes what comes next. They can lead to something bigger. A change in monetization strategy for your whole product can be driven by an insight found around conversion. So an example of what an insight might be is you're doing an analysis on the pricing page for something. Look at what is bringing people to the pricing page. So it's adjacent to the work you're already doing, the work that's already on your plate, but spend a couple hours understanding what comes next. So we've talked a lot here about what data teams are, how to build them, the types of work you're doing. How do we know if we're being successful? There's this great blog post by Barry McCardle, CEO of Hex, talking about how you don't tell your data team's ROI story, like let other people tell it for you. And I think about this a lot because I think this is the answer, right? If our data teams are being successful, other people will be lobbying for us. It is very hard in a world where we're saying that like insights and impact and number of decisions, these are non-quantifiable things or not easily quantifiable things. It can be very hard to kind of measure our success. And I know that that seems ironic given that we are the data team, but this is one way that we see that, right? Having other people as advocates is a way we can measure the data team's success. Remember that the value of the data team is a function of the number and volume of decisions you're enabling. So don't get stuck in the trap of measuring like the volume of data you have or the number of dashboards you've built. You want to measure business impact, not output. So for example, the uplift in revenue from work started by an insight or improved onboarding throughput by targeting comms through operational analytics work, like those are things where the data team doesn't get the full credit, right? That uplift in revenue from work started by an insight does not belong to the data team. It's a collaborative thing. You may find the initial insight that shapes the proposal, that shapes the experiment, that all the way through. But that is the sort of thing to collect, and that is the business impact you're having. An idea is to consider measuring NPS for overall satisfaction with the data team. And remember that no feedback is feedback. So if people are complaining about the data team, there you go, that's how people are feeling. But no feedback is feedback. And I think an effective data team is one thing where oftentimes you only hear things if they're going wrong. So that's all I've got. I do want to keep this conversation going. So you can find me on Twitter. My handle is just my full name. I'm also going to be hanging out in Hopin, so happy to answer questions and share links. And I will turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Emilie.
Thank you.
We can keep the conversation going at least for a few minutes, about 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Great.
But first of all, how is your child?
Thank you. Yeah, my son, I have a small infant son, had a bit of a fever on Monday. And with everything going on in the world, COVID protocols say that he cannot go back to daycare until 72 hours after no fever. So I'm very glad to say he went back to daycare today.
Yeah, and we are glad that you made it because, yeah, priorities are different.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to see you here and that your son is okay.
Thank you.
So I would like to remind the audience that you can vote on questions and you can still put questions for Emilie. But we already have a few, so let's start. The first one is, wouldn't the use of quantified KPIs lead the data team to deliver large amount of data quickly rather than seeking manual insights?
It could, but KPIs are not insights, and the next level question from KPIs is almost always an insight. So a very specific example would be new users, right? So new users might be a KPI for the business. It's the top of your acquisition funnel. But when there's sudden spike in new users, people want to understand where those users are coming from. And that is an insight. If you're breaking down kind of what brought them here, what led to a spike, are these users like our other users? That is insight work. That's not just KPIs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's see the next question. Analysts may create very complete and often quite complicated report analysis. Does every time customers and requesters of such reports are able to understand the soul of the analysis? And what are you doing in such a case?
Yeah, it can be hard where like the analysis is almost more technical than what the business stakeholder asked for. I think part of what we have to do as data people is make sure we're speaking the language of our partners. So I think of what data people need to be doing is thinking of themselves as business partners for the organization instead of kind of, I'm the data person who's going to chuck the analysis at you. If you deliver an analysis and it never gets used, all you did was waste your time. So in order to make sure we're building analyses that are impactful to the organization, we have to make sure we're putting that analysis at the right level for the person we're delivering the analysis to. And so you're going to talk to and write an analysis for a fellow data person or a statistician or a whomever it might be, at a very different level than if you're presenting something to the CEO or to the VP, right? And so knowing who your audience is for even an analysis is important because we want to make sure we're acting as partners and not just fetchers.
Thank you. So let's see. Next question. What are great resources to follow in the data space to understand more about how other teams are working?
Okay, so I really love Locally Optimistic, as you can tell. So that's locallyoptimistic.com. There is also a Slack community for LO, so strongly recommend. There is the Analytics Engineering Roundup, which is a newsletter by Tristan Handy and Anna Filipova of the folks at DBT Labs. That is really great. And I think that's analyticsengineering.roundup.com or something like that. But that's a Substack. And then Ben Stansel, the co-founder of Mode, has a Substack that is benn.substack.com, and he has been doing some really phenomenal writing on how we allow data teams to be impactful that I really enjoy, and those usually come out on Fridays. So those would be the three that I would point to off the top of my head. But there's also, I think, being plugged into the space and plugging into data communities like Locally Optimistic is a great place to see like what conversations people are having.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what are good teams to target to serve in the early stages of your data team?
It definitely depends on your organization. So you need to think about what kind of business you are to answer that question effectively. And let's think through a couple of examples together. So if you work for a direct-to-consumer e-commerce company, then you are probably a marketing-led organization. And where that's the case, the first group you want to serve is marketing. If you are a sales-driven organization, the first group to serve is probably going to be finance and sales. So your first KPIs are going to be kind of revenue, MRR, annual contract value, like those sorts of things. Whereas if you're in that marketing-led organization, you're thinking much more about your acquisition funnel, early indicators of conversion. If you're in a product-led company, you're going to be looking in product usage data and what are good usage indicators of conversion? What does average time between sign up and conversion look like? So you very much need to reflect on how your organization has set the business strategy, and then your data strategy needs to follow your business strategy.
Okay, thank you. Now the last question. How do you think about scaling the data team with the organization?
Good question. I think part of the reason the service model doesn't serve data teams is that if you are a service organization, you need to scale linearly with your company, right? So your data team will need to continue to be 6, 7, 8% of your company's headcount as you grow. And so we need to think about how we allow data teams to be more effective and not be service organizations if we're going to grow with the organization in a way that doesn't limit our ability to have an impact. Because, you know, the last thing CFOs like to hear is we need to grow linearly or exponentially even with the organization, right? Because the bigger your company is, the more questions your data team will have. So with that in mind, I think understanding who you're serving fewer markets well, and then having other advocates in the organization who align and see the impact of your data team, who can lobby for your team. So instead of data headcount constantly coming from the data team, having the VP of marketing who now wants a marketing person to specialize on the data team, having that VP of marketing go and get that headcount and let that support the data team. That's, I think, how we grow and scale, because otherwise your data org will always be seen as a cost center. The other thing that I'll mention is harking back to impact. Like, it is much easier for your data team to grow and scale with the organization if people see the impact that your team is having. So when you see things like our insight led to the work that led to that uplift in revenue, that is a really great opportunity for you to store that feather in your cap and kind of tuck it away so that when people are asking, like, what are the things that the data team has done, you can point to those sorts of impacts.
Thank you very much, Emilie.